Hey, Ben. How are you? It's Travis again.
Travis, I just don't hear enough about you, Travis. I'm beginning to be concerned that
PJ runs the place.
no, but you must be doing something surreptitious.
I wish.
Whenever lawyers get real quiet, I get nervous.
I'm still trying to figure out what that word you used a few minutes ago meant.
Surreptitious is hard to spell too. When you look it up, it's got a bunch of letters you think it shouldn't.
The funny part here is that you think I'm going to look it up.
I don't think it's funny. I just know that Travis is going to work it into a closing.
I've always been impressed by your vocabulary.
He is a thesaurus.
Law light, twice the obscure information, half the calories.
This case should never have come to trial.
I don't think it's fair to call my clients frauds. Because one time I turned into a dog and they helped me. Thank you.
Your Honor, we would like to withdraw our plea of not guilty and enter a plea of guilty.
This trial is a travesty. It's a travesty of a mockery, of a sham, of a mockery, of a travesty, of two mockeries, of a sham.
If we are to have faith in justice, we need only to believe in ourselves.
And the truth shall set you free!
How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Oh, guilty, but with a real good excuse.
I think the truth will come forth.
You can't handle the truth!
All right, everybody, it's time for more Law Lite, brought to you by Foreman Watson Holtry, fwhlegal.com. We are at the high-rise white brick edifice. That's a big word for you there, Ben. Sit at 530 Frederica Street, and PJ and I are in the library, studio, and multi-purpose room.
That's right.
And let's not waste any more time. We are excited today because we have a friend who has been a guest with us, I think, at least on 2, maybe 3 occasions. Benjamin Busch, yesterday afternoon. PJ was talking to me, and he told me some of your latest endeavors, and I was like, man, if we can get him on, that'd be great, because we've talked about some of the happenings in the Ukraine, and when I heard about this, I thought it would be great. So thanks, as always, for making yourself available to us.
Absolutely. My availability is always in demand, and I portion it out to the most important venues. Of course, Law Lite being very
Law Lite is the big draw, right?
That's right.
That's right. Ben, before we get to the primary issues that I want to talk to you about, and PJ's wanting to talk to you about, I want to ask, the last time that you and I spoke, you were building, I believe, an addition on your home. You actually sent me a picture. How did that turn out? Is it still a project?
It's still very much a project. You can ask my wife all about what progress means as defined by me versus her. There was a huge run on, as you might guess, the supply chain, which
Right.
took all the lumber from, regular 3/4 inch 4x8 sheet of plywood, went from, $31 to $90.
Right.
And it's creeping back down again. So it basically made the cost of everything twice or more as expensive, even if you're doing it yourself. So we kind of went into what we call an operational pause, which means everything gets tarped, and then we get to watch climate change blow the tarps off in kind of a ritual habit all winter long, and now for spring. So if you saw it now, it would look a little bit like I was moving into a house that's not supposed to be occupied. And squatting. I'm squatting in my own house. But I'm gonna. The warm weather's coming back, so it's time for me to begin roofing and all that kind of good stuff.
Well, you've also been doing, making some important trips, and man, I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I guess to kind of break the ice into this, you and 2 other veterans had the opportunity recently to go to the Ukraine for the purpose of assisting there. And I want you to fill in the details, but my insight to it was the Anderson Cooper piece, and I know there's probably so much more to it. And so I'm just, kind of take us from the beginning. How did the whole idea come up? Had you served with Adrian and Matt, or how did it just kind of come to be that this was an opportunity for you?
Yeah, well, as I always seem to, there were a number of very disparate angles by which we all kind of came together. I illustrated a book called The Road Ahead and have a short story in it called Into the Land of Dogs. It's a collection anthology of veteran fiction, and Adrian Bronenberger was one of the editors. I met him basically through that project where I did the 24 illustrations, one for each story. Matt Gallagher is another veteran writer who I met at a reading in Brooklyn when I was touring Dust to Dust, my memoir. He wrote a memoir called Kaboom. The two of us met just briefly in Brooklyn one night. It was Adrian Bonenberger, who had gone to Ukraine earlier in kind of Ukraine's rising. And he was there around the time that Russia seized Crimea. And he was there for, I think 2014 and intermittently on from there. And he married a Ukrainian journalist named Irina. When this entire conflict began, all of us were taken by surprise that Russia would go so far. And her parents are 70 years old, and they live in Kyiv, the capital.
Right.
And they were very reluctant to be refugees, but the capital was getting shelled. So Irina and Adrian cocked up a plan to go have her brother extricate them from Kyiv in what would be a 48-hour drive, which would normally take a couple hours, to get them from Kyiv to Lviv, which is a city to the west, a very pivotal city. He called us and said, "Hey, I'm leaving in 3 days to go to Ukraine." And while we're there, I thought, since these villages and towns and cities are being encircled by Russians and attacked, we could train civilians to defend their city while we're there. Urban tactics and guerrilla warfare are kind of my thing. So, having fought in Ramadi on the other side of urban tactics, the defense always has the advantage. So, my thinking was, of course, we'll show them everything that an opponent could do to prepare them to beat exactly that scenario as defenders.
Right.
I stayed up till 3 a.m. after getting my wife's and my daughter's permission to go. Finally got tickets to Krakow, Poland, and we all met up in the Krakow airport 2 days later. In the cover of night, jumped on a bus and were driven to Lviv, where we began the whole process of assembling citizens under the auspices of generally the city council and some other hard to even identify officials. And for 2 weeks in an abandoned factory area, kind of a hellscape of former Soviet factories and plants, we created essentially a bombed out outskirts and trained them to fight in it in case the Russians continued. That's exactly the scenario they'd be fighting under. So we wanted to create everything that they'd be exposed to and only use what they had resident. Very few supplies. We didn't want them to think that they would be supported in any other way than by themselves alone. So we didn't teach them how to use javelins. We didn't teach them how to use anything sexy because we had to assume they wouldn't have it.
Right.
So basically went down and created a full guerrilla force that could defend its own city. And, my thought always was you can weaponize anything if it's space. If what you're trying to do is buy time and buy it with blood of the enemy, then you can turn a city into a castle. You can turn every house into a fortress. And you can also give them up rather than lives.
Right.
You can retrograde back into your own community and fight your own streets. Who knows them better than you?
Right.
So that was my purpose there, along with the other three. And for 2 weeks, that's what we did with 50 to 60 Ukrainians. And they were, they ranged in age from a 23-year-old IT recruiter to, a 50-year-old construction worker.
Right.
And I had 2 lawyers in my squad. We divided into 3 squads. And of course, we cross-trained everybody, but, we all also kind of had our own squad.
Mm-hmm.
And, mine just happened to have 2, and I began to name people as you do in the military. So I had my IT worker became Danger Rabbit, and Matt had a 16-year-old kid who was just a short kid, but his parents said, "Yeah, go ahead, go learn these things." And Matt called him Battle Mouse, and I had. From Tombstone, I had a lawyer, so I called him Law Dog.
Law Dog, yeah.
And I had another lawyer who happened to be one of the most important lawyers in the city. We found out later, who took his 2 weeks of leave from his own firm to become. We called him RoboCop because he was pretty well funded, so he bought all kinds of military attire. Like he came in completely tricked out. We thought he'd been a huge veteran of the war, and he never fired a rifle. He'd never nothing. So,
but he had the goods.
Yeah, he had just seen a lot of American movies.
He had seen every American movie, and he spoke decent English too.
Mm-hmm.
He's well educated lawyer, and the funny thing was he had courtroom presence, so we assumed that he was a commander of sorts, that he had some experience in the military because he could organize a group and spoke with such incredible authority. We just completely assumed he was a veteran. And when I interviewed all my squad members, and finally I was like, so who, where did you train? And he's like, oh no, I have never trained before. No, I have watched the movies, and I'm a lawyer. I know how to speak. So we basically made him into a trainer of trainees after a certain point, because he was quick to learn things, and he took it so seriously that after hours, as lawyers do, he was researching how many videos he must have seen on YouTube about door kicking, various other improvised devices you can only imagine. Then we left, which was hard to do at that point. I would like to have taken it further.
Right.
It was hard for me not to even fight, but that was not the agreement I made with my family or my country. So I did what I could in a small capacity inside an immense disaster.
Did someone know that the three of you were coming for this purpose, or did you have to get
Nope.
feet on the ground and kind of find the officials that would be able to help organize it? To take them? How did that work?
Adrian's wife had been a journalist in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of knew how to negotiate her way through the byways of very complicated Ukrainian leadership and politics. She was able to figure out who to make connection with in the city itself, and we basically had to go in and audition. We went in as the three of us. We had an interpreter who had worked with NATO before, a woman who was top notch, super smart, and she had just come from Kyiv, where she'd been in a bunker for like a week being bombed. Talk about hardened individuals. She's going to have to deal with kind of letting the trauma of that come out at some point, but she had it all bottled up like you do in order to survive. And she interpreted for us, although a few of them, I could tell just by their eyes, understood English very well, but didn't want to volunteer that they did. And there were some town council members. There was a representative officer in uniform from the Territorial Defense Forces, which is kind of like the reserves, American reserves versus active duty. And there were a few other questionable individuals, probably Ukrainian intelligence. We had no idea who they were. And they gave away nothing. Very interesting people. They studied everyone's expressions. They listened to words very carefully. You could tell they were just completely evaluating whether we were legitimate, what we really had to offer. They were separating salesmanship from true experience, because they had tons of people coming into the cities now to offer their services, many of them for a fee. And we'd flown ourselves, of course, on our own dime, on our own time. Mm-hmm. We wanted nothing except the opportunity to help. And, we all pitched kind of what we specialized in and had experience in. And I went on just a very brief explanation of mostly Ramadi, my year there. And afterwards we had kind of two people. One of them had been a council member, but also was connected to kind of private money and business money in the area. And another who will never know who this guy was. For damn sure he knows who we are. And he was able to kind of connect, basic necessity with action. Mm-hmm. Like we need a compound of buildings that we can run through, kick doors out of, smash things, set up roadblocks in, and no one can see us. And he would just nod and go, okay. And the next day we'd have one.
Wow.
We need rifles for everyone to train. Only 3 people have weapons out of the entire civilian group that we're composing. And he would just say, okay. And the next day, there's this you saw it on Anderson Cooper. This collector who has kind of his own private military museum just walked over and gave us 50 Mausers and Soviet machine guns and grease guns and rifles and shotguns. Some of them were from the 1930s. And so suddenly everyone had a weapon to train with, at least to get the feel of it. So as we did room clearing, as we did movements to contact, all these different things, they could actually hold something until they got, actual fully armed. And over the course of the time, about 25 of them bought their own rifles. And we got a few AKs, old AKs, kind of donated from who knows where. And my hope, of course, was to establish an armory before I left, which I wasn't able to do. Everything's being pushed to the front for obvious reasons.
Right.
But a lot of them now have their own. The only issue, of course, is they're exotic weapons by any count. So getting ammunition is going to be difficult.
That's what I was going to ask, is how many rounds would they have for those types of
yeah,
guns?
It all comes down to, the international ammunition market.
Right.
There's, if you watch War Dogs and The God of War, that stuff actually is true. We had a meeting in a dark cafe with some operators we were hoping would replace us at one point, and one of them just kind of, you can tell he's been sly in the business for some time. He just kind of said, well, I know a place in Slovakia we can get AKs for $800, and a new one you can get them for about $1,000, and older junky ones you can get for about $500. I can probably roll about 50,000 old AK rounds in here, no problem. And just kind of speaking that way,
Wow.
you think you're in a film, and I'm like, well, yeah, that will do. Can you make that happen? Can you make that happen? He's like, yeah, I think we can. We can get some money attached to it and work that out. I'm like, great. Okay, my job here is done. I don't have that capacity.
Is that why when you did the live target practice, each person had 10 rounds?
Yeah, I was only able to get that was through our guy. Where I said, we need to at least have 1,000 rounds, and we need to make sure we have at least 10 very serviceable AK-47s to train with, so we have a uniform weapon. They're all firing, and we need an instructor. And of course, as always, he said, okay. And on that day, 500 loose rounds showed up, and 10 AKs, and an old instructor who, this guy, you can tell he probably served in Afghanistan with the Soviet Army. He's probably in his 60s, and he looked like someone you just don't want to mess with. Just stay off his yard.
Right.
And he gave a really good class on it. But of course, I'm coming from the Marines, where weapons maintenance and all this kind of stuff was a chief issue. I'm like, okay, so we're gonna have to be concerned with making sure we have rifle lubricant and all this other stuff. And he's like, why? I'm like, what do you mean why? You have to remember that AKs are really sloppy weapons. They're not super accurate past 200 yards, but they don't jam. They were kind of made to be a third world equivalency. The M16 jammed all the time, and because it's so finely milled that getting sand in it makes it a mess. Whereas the AK is so loose, it shoots through everything. It was almost like a joke, like, Americans and your clean rifles. these AKs, I can lubricate them with mud. So that was the final course. But actually, the interesting thing about that is we were hoping to use the rifle ranges in Yabariv, which is about 20 miles away from Kyiv, or from Lviv, and we didn't actually end up getting to do that. But the night before we did the rifle range, Yabariv was hit with 30 cruise missiles. It's a kind of a NATO and Ukrainian training base. You talk about near misses and things like that. Interesting times.
Yeah.
One of the things that jumped out at me with what you were talking about, and that was one of the things that jumped out when I was watching the Anderson Cooper story, is that, being an American, we are a very gun prevalent society. I personally know someone that owns over 160 guns, everything from handguns to assault shotguns to sniper rifles, like the legit movie, like the kinds you see that the military uses, to just, like machine guns and everything. And it really surprised me when he was talking about, and when you talk about how difficult it was to find weapons and ammunition, because it seems like, here, if I wanted to today, I could go get a bunch of guns as long as I can pay for it, and a ton of ammunition, and we just have it so readily available. I know so many people in this country that have guns and plenty of ammunition for said guns. So going over there, is that something that you already had experience with, like going and working in other countries with other civilians and things, where it's difficult to get weapons and ammunition in other countries, or was this something that you'd never been faced with before?
No, we've never been faced with this. I mean, the American lie to itself is that we need to be, prepared to fight the government all the time, which is silly,
Right.
And so people who have large stocks, that's almost comic in its habit. But, people collect all kinds of things. Some people collect Star Wars figures. I'm fine with all of it. But the necessity is not there. And the claim to necessity, of course, is one of the frailest of all mythologies. But I have rifles. I live on a farm. I need a 22 because raccoons attack my chickens. I got to take sides, But I don't think the Marines are going to drive light armor reconnaissance against my house.
Or your chickens.
I think we could negotiate something about chickens if that was the scenario. But but
you're like, look, I'm just trying to get these tarps off my house so I can finish this project.
You guys lend me a hand. I could use them when digging some trenches. That's a wholly different scenario that I don't buy into with a whole lot of enthusiasm, other than basic utility and necessity. But think about it. How many armies are attacking America right now? We're jumping out of our suburbs to defend, against the hordes. Personal defense weapons, I don't have a problem with that. If you're well trained, that's one thing. I want to make sure you are, and your mental health is not in question.
Yeah, that's the key.
if I can get that combination right there, where you just want to make sure your house is safe and you're not a lunatic, that's I'm fine with that. I have no problem with policies that allow for Americans to have that. Do you need an anti-tank gun? Do you need machine guns? You probably just ought to work on your aim.
Yeah.
I always hear people like, "Oh yeah, this thing fires." I got this magazine with 28 rounds. I'm like, man, that deer is really closing on you. To each their own. Believe what you will. I'm not an anti-gun person, but I'm an anti-gun mismanagement person.
Right. I think we all are that.
I don't know, about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, when I think we were about a week or two into Russia advancing into the Ukraine. PJ and I had a discussion here on the podcast about PJ, I asked him, I said, if you were told, look, it's coming, and you need to stand your ground. You need to fight for and you need to send your family away, and you need to stay here. Like, how would you react to that emotionally?
And I asked him how much a Russian citizenship costs.
No, we didn't. We were.
I'm joking.
We were saying, it's hard because again, we have no concept of this here, right? I mean,
right.
My biggest concern is to remember to put my garbage out on Thursday night so that Friday it's gone, right? If you really sit for a second and pause and internalize it and are honest with yourself, if someone came to me, said, look, we're organizing every male between the age of 20 and 60 in Owensboro to defend, what would my emotional response be? And, obviously there would be fear attached to that. In my mind, if it's at that point, it is a readiness and saying, okay, educate me as quick as we can. Let's do what we can. It's roll up your sleeves still to this day, even though in my lifetime there's never been anything remotely close to this happening to us. I mean, 9/11, which was a wake-up call for America that we can be attacked on our own soil, but still the whole take up arms and help defend your country.
It wasn't an invasion.
That's
right.
Yeah.
No.
And so the question, that's a big wind up for this question. I guess it struck me, Ben, when you said that Matt or Adrian in their platoon had a 16-year-old, and then it went up to age, I guess you said in the 50s, and I'm 52. What was the overall of this group of 50, 60 people that you, men that you were working with? What was the emotion? Could you see fear in their eyes? Could you hear fear in their voice? Or was it that it had to overcome the fear and it was were they gung-ho? What was the emotion? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, I guess I would say, and I've trained lots of military personnel in my years. And
which is different, right? I mean, they've signed up or they know what they're...
Well, sure, and they're all the same, general age,
right.
From 18 to 20 something,
right.
And they joined for whatever their purposes, mistakes or otherwise, whatever their idea of patriotism or just getting out of North Dakota, or family traditions, all kinds of things come into play, as you might imagine. You're pulling from the entire country and all of its facets, but you train all the time. There's almost a boredom to a lot of it. There's not that feeling of imminent danger, except when we were working up to go to Iraq, when we knew we were going to Iraq, or however many years before that I was training. It was always, we may use this. We need to know this. We may use this. There was never really the feeling that someone's going to shoot back. Mm-hmm. There was always the predominant feeling that we're going to have air support, we're going to have artillery support, we are going to be hell on earth, and we were. But there wasn't the feeling. And I didn't decorate it with the feeling that we were vulnerable. Mm-hmm. There was almost that immortality idea that, you carry it that way. It allows you to survive what normally fear would tell you to do, which is run like we're crazy.
Hide, right.
So we're going the wrong direction. And that was the thing about, I think I talked about it earlier, my first tour as a commander of light armor reconnaissance in Iraq and the invasion, even I convinced myself that I couldn't be killed. And it's because everyone was looking to me. I had 150 Marines looking to me for a sense of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't project that. Mm-hmm. And after a certain point, I believed it, mm-hmm. Which didn't make me careless, but it also relieved me of the burden of certain worries. I worried about my Marines because, they were my responsibility, but I almost didn't have responsibility for myself anymore. Mm-hmm. My second tour in Ramadi, in 2005, I was wounded my first 2 weeks. I was convinced that I was going to be killed in Ramadi. I couldn't tell my family or anybody, but I was pretty sure I was a dead man walking. Odd thing about that is it creates the same feeling. Being invulnerable and being dead already, you just don't have any worries. And that's useful, at least in that job. But these Ukrainians, the war was at their doorstep. Their family members were already affected. Many of them, almost all the men had already sent their wives and children into Poland or Slovakia. And they were 18 to 60, as you'd said. They were, by martial law, required to stay in Ukraine and fight. At the border, when we crossed, there were very few men. And most of them had some kind of, disability, or they were required to take care of a child themselves, like, a single parent, or they had a child with disabilities. So they had a waiver. But everybody else was in town. And their feeling was, we're here to fight, so teach us. So they were absolutely transfixed. They studied everything we did. They listened to everything. They didn't treat it casually. They didn't get bored. It was tiring training. They didn't waver. And these are people who, walked directly out of their jobs. I mean, like I said, I had Law Dog and RoboCop. And, during lunch, I talked to them afterwards briefly, like, what's going on? This goes right back to law. I mean, you're looking at a whole world trying to figure out how to charge a country that's committing war crimes with committing war crimes.
Right.
That's going to be the huge legal issue for the world to figure out. And they are. One lawyer had a case where he had a client. The client has a business partner who happens to be Russian, because, it's an international country. Mm-hmm. Before the war, Ukraine and Russia were doing a lot of exchange. Well, we froze all of Russian assets for almost everything. And because of the Russian partner, his whole company had been paralyzed because their assets had been frozen by association with the Russian. So this lawyer is just trying to figure out how to sever at least half so the business can continue to operate in the absence of its affiliation with a Russian partner. I had another who was like, we even have domestic issues of the size which you wouldn't expect. What if you want to get divorced? I have a client right now who's in town. He can't leave. He's of age. He's not in any hurry to do so. He doesn't want to. He wants to serve, as necessary. But he's in the middle of a divorce proceeding with his wife. She's a refugee in Poland now. Try to figure out how to pull that stunt off in court. So these are very small things we would take for granted in this country, but for a family, it's a huge big deal. And so everyone's trying to figure out how to triage law. Like, okay, what can wait? I think we've foregone traffic tickets at this point in the war, but everything else that's contractual in nature has to go through a legal proceeding in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
So think about your job as not just defending your house, but also what if all your clients suddenly had these problems?
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that we've missed in our discussions and kind of what we've been, is that life is still going on. There's still business. There's still commerce. Right. There's still, there's still gross national product. There's all this that has to continue and defend your country and educate them how to, it's. I've gone to Africa 4 different occasions, 4 different areas of Africa, and every time, the main thing that I came back with is that you can't conceive in your mind, because our reference points here are so bipolar of that. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And until you're there, and I would have, I guess, until you just said that, Ben, about this lawyer who's trying to figure out these everyday things. Yeah, I understand his plight. I mean, that's what we are. We get in the middle of these problems and we try to figure them out. That's what lawyers are. Some say we make more problems, but genuinely, you're solving legal riddles. And so now you have an invasion going on top of what's already a complicated process, life. And I hadn't even stopped to consider. It's not like everything stopped and everything was just let's all we're doing now is fighting a war. We're fighting a war and we're still trying to survive, in other areas of life. That's right.
Well, one thing that you pointed out too that I've never really thought about is when I think of I love war movies, and I'm pretty sure I've said this in previous podcast when you came on, that I've always felt like if I was ever in a war, I would be probably more like Upham from Saving Private Ryan, where everybody's waiting on me to bring them the ammunition and I'm crying in a crater somewhere, but I have no frame of reference for war, And
Upham does shoot the guy who kills Tom Hanks.
That's true. And you know what? Everyone loves Tom Hanks, and he fully vindicated himself in that moment.
So you've got hope.
That's thank you. We started talking about Tom Hanks, and I totally lost my train of thought.
No, war movies is what your reference was.
So anytime I think of war, when you see war movies, it's always about the soldiers, right? So it's about what you've done for a living, and that's exactly what it is. Even though it's more than just a job, it still is a job, right? So it comes with a paycheck, even a small one, I'm sure, but still, it's it comes with a paycheck.
It comes with everything. If you think about the military, it's the most close we're ever going to get to communism.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying is when you went over there and you had Russia is attacking everyone, not just the military in that country. Everyone is having to step up, like the scenario that Travis was bringing up earlier. It's you wake up one day and now suddenly you have to be a soldier because you're not given a choice. But at the same time, that's not your job. But if you're in a situation to where you're in a city being shelled and your business gets destroyed, it's what are they doing for income? Like a pizza delivery guy in Ukraine is still trying to have to deliver pizzas so he can make money to eat and pay for his bills, but at the same time defend his apartment from getting blown up, but also still trying to deliver pizza. I mean, I don't even know how you would juggle that.
Yeah, I don't know how the economics are working out in terms of, I think everything in terms of debt has been suspended. Things like that. Like you said, everyone's trying to still wake up and get bread.
Right.
the basic necessities of life have to continue, and you have to find them in the wreckage. That's what a lot of the aid, of course, is. There's tons of aid flowing into Ukraine, and how it's distributed, of course, is the difficult part, because some of these places like Mariupol and Kharkiv and recently Bucha, they're surrounded. And then when the Russians pull out of them, everyone's dead. So it's a question of who can escape. How do you defend against that? And afterwards, how do you get? I mean, this is going to be a huge law question. How do you sue Russia for blowing up your house?
Very carefully.
Well, we took all their money, but we're still paying for oil and gas.
Right.
That like $280 million a day goes to Russia just for their energy assets. Who's gonna turn that money into compensation? Russia's not apologizing for anything. They're not even apologizing for killing civilians. They just don't care. And it's, not Russians in general, Putin, Putin and his military officers. It's their war. I mean, this all ends if someone just gets rid of Putin. Right. And what I think, going back to our movies fixation, as you and I have, PJ, what this whole thing has taught me is that there is no Jason Bourne. It ruins every single high-profile sub-governmental assassin movie that's ever been made. Because if we had that guy, Putin would be dead and the war would be over.
Right.
But he's
and
not.
I've brought that scenario up.
We have brought that up.
I was like, at one point I was like, why doesn't somebody just black bag this guy? Like, I don't get it. Why hasn't that happened?
That was the idea behind the sanctions. They weren't targeted at the Russian people so much as the Russian oligarchs. Mm-hmm. That's what all those huge billionaires' frozen assets were about. They were hoping that because they put him in power and they sustained him, that they would also, if they lost everything, would get rid of him. If that was the objective, of course, with Biden and NATO especially pushing those sanctions, was to squeeze the only circle he really has as
squeeze his supporters. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and hopefully one of them would just say, you know what, this has gone too far. We don't care about Ukraine, but we care about our billions. And there's one guy who's the problem. Right. And one of them would take him out, but Putin's got his finger on every single body who could possibly pose a threat to him, and it's so far it's failed. They haven't squeezed anything out of him.
Wow,
so
that's scary.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're an absolutist, I mean, the other problem is he's removed all the stages between him and essentially it's directly to him to the guy pushing the button on ICBMs. There used to be all kinds of checks and balances, like the president of the United States can't just launch a nuclear attack.
Right.
It goes through all kinds of people. And with Putin, it just goes to the guy with the button, which is why he's been able to hold off direct intervention by U.S. forces, NATO forces, is the threat of this becoming absolute war, where he has everything to lose, so why not lose it if that's going to be his last act? I don't know how much of it is smoke and mirrors. I know a game of suicide is always a strange one to guess at, but that's why we've been keeping our troops out. And that's why I had to go as a global citizen. I didn't flare that I was American. I'm not working under the auspices of the U.S. government at all. And that was an important differentiation to make.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
And the Ukrainians, were able to see American support without
the stars and stripes.
Exactly, and that was an important thing to also separate us from, is that we come as support from America. America does support you, but we can't fight for you.
Right.
However, we still don't really know the status of the International Legion, which has Americans and British and all kinds of people in it. Its numbers are projected at 20,000, but no one can confirm it. They may be engaged in combat, but no one can confirm it. They may have had casualties, but no one will confirm it. So there's as much promotional PR propaganda that currently is really owned entirely by Ukraine. Russians are shut out of it on every platform. So the bad part is the Russian people barely know what's happening. They really don't. And that's why there's not widespread revolt
right
against the war, is because
controlling the communication.
They're absolutely, Yeah, state media controls all information, so of course everything is justified, and that Russia's winning, and you know, it's a difficult game to apply counter narratives into, because there's no platform to deliver. The Facebook, all these other, Twitter, they're all banned. It's hard to reach the people who could make change within their own country, because no one would support this. The greatest trick that the Ukrainians pulled was the first Russian captives. They gave them phones and told them to call home, and they recorded the whole thing. And these young Russian soldiers, who many of them didn't even know they were really in an invasion until they got shot at, were calling home and saying, you know, I'm being treated well by the Ukrainians, you know, and their parents are like, where are you?
Oh my God.
What are you talking about?
Wow.
You're a captive? And so they had this all on tape, and it was a brilliant, first of all, PR move by the Ukrainians, but secondly, it revealed a lot about what Russia doesn't know. And you know, they've had estimations of 15 to 30,000 casualties. And this is one of the things that shocked me, actually. And it takes a lot to shock me. Even PJ's movies don't stand up to this. They have mobile crematorium, and the only reason they stopped burning bodies is because they couldn't get fuel. But I mean, what army carries a mobile crematorium unit with it? That's an army that wants to hide
yeah,
civilian casualties
Wow.
and casualties. So we'll never. I mean, I don't think we'll ever know
true numbers,
the full true numbers of what's happened. And for the people in the East, which I think is really Putin's only real goal, all of the oil and gas assets in Ukraine are in those two eastern provinces, essentially.
right.
But if, you know, we're hearing the Ukrainians are pushing them away from Kyiv. No, I mean, yes, but no. The Russians are withdrawing to the areas they really want to control, and now they're going to establish hardened defenses. And that, it's far easier to fight someone who's on the offense. It's much more difficult to fight them on the defense.
Right.
And it's also harder to get them out. And what's happening to anyone in the East is they can't evacuate to the West. They're forced to evacuate into Russia, which means they're, you know, I'm talking about other war crimes. They're being interrogated. They might be being executed. We don't know. They're certainly being, you know, rape is widespread. And we don't have contact with any of these people. They have no phones. They're captives. And we're talking how many thousands at this point? We just don't know. It's kind of one of those things where it's so unbelievable, we don't have a response to it. What I'd hoped, of course, by now is that the UN would just step in like it did in Bosnia too late. Right. You know, this was all happening in Bosnia. The UN finally went in and stood between it, because it's a superpower that sits on the UN and has only just recently been removed from the Human Rights Council.
Right. That's
you know, how do you intervene when the army at stake is fully in combat mode? You know, what happens when we send in UN troops and the Russians shoot at them? That's the scenario. Yeah, of course they will. Of course they will. And you know, that's a scenario. Like when is it? What happens next after the U.S. shoots down a Russian plane?
Right. Right.
In an area which is not in any way under the jurisdiction or protection of the U.S., because, you know, Ukraine's not a UN nation. Right. So there's, I mean, all this stuff's going on. I don't even remember what I started talking about.
No, well, this is exactly why, you know, we wanted to talk to you, because this is genuinely something that we've kind of been surfacing and reminding each other of on past episodes and stuff, because it is a major thing, and we feel we're kind of insulated from it when we go about our everyday suburban life, you know, and to hear this is it's certainly something that I hope more people will hear and at least try to understand the different factors that are in play here.
The end of every one of my training periods, the three of us, I would get up and then say, okay, as you go home to your house, your apartment today, imagine how you would fight your street. Imagine that you have to get the rest of the residents in your apartment building, which is 10 stories tall, out. Imagine how you would barricade a street to force an army to use areas of less resistance. Imagine you have to delay long enough to get elders back into a space that they can be evacuated from. How do you buy time in the space that you own? Imagine if you did that to your own house, just everyone listening. into the suburbs, like the things you don't think about, like how do you use a building as a barricade, and how do you choose your way into alleys or backyards undercover? Where do you look for dips in the terrain to use as cover if you had to get away under fire? How do you organize your community? Like suddenly Ed next door, who we never talk to, the two of you just drive up to your suburban houses. Maybe you even mow your own lawns. But other than that, you have no relationship, really. It's what the suburbs are like now. They're not communities the way they used to be. How do you suddenly bond with Ed and Fred and Lisa across the street? How do you suddenly become a unit that has a singular focus, an objective that's communal, that's life-saving? How do you decide who stays? Who buys time for whom? Think about that in America right now, where our selfishness has overwhelmed us to the point where we don't even believe the truth anymore, where we're so willing to fixate on things which reinforce our bias that we chime after memes. We can be easily led by the simplicity of one line, just because it feels familiar enough for us to be comfortable with it rather than be challenged. Think about how to bond people into a community again like that, where everything is suddenly at stake. Everything. Not posing, not, I have 100 guns. Great. Then you're going to be the one who stays. Right. You go over there. Where are you going to position yourself to provide the most overwatch? Oh, and by the way, you're definitely going to be sacrificing yourself, because unless you have a plan to retrograde by fire, they're going to blow up that house that you're in. So, how do you begin to think about what that means on a street? And, my ending line was always the same. At some point, the Russians could go home, but you are home.
The one thing that I've been thinking about through this entire conversation, and I think it's directed at America, and that is a phrase that I've heard a lot, especially within like the last decade. And that is, no one else's brand of suffering is any worse than mine, right? And it's because we're so spoiled that we think that that's the truth.
Totally far from the truth.
I've always been like, that's garbage. No. Just because I have to stand in line at the DMV for 3 hours, which sucks, it is not worse than having my child sex trafficked. It tends to be the whiners. They're the ones who look at life that way, because they want to believe that their problems are just as great as someone else's. And I'm sorry, just because someone calls me fat, it's not worse than a 16-year-old having to be told by an American Marine that you got to go home and think about the 1,000 ways you are going to have to potentially protect yourself and your family for a coming invasion. To me, that's a far graver situation. Hearing a lot of this, to me, should be a wake-up call for, just because your mocha chocolate latte wasn't made correctly.
Ben, how did you help but feel like that this was a drop in the bucket when you think of how frail their situation really is? You just, I guess it was hand to the plow and just let's do what we can and get the most out of every day with these guys, because you only had limited time, huh?
Right. Well, you create progressional training.
Right.
You start off at 0. We assumed that we had 0. And some of them worked, even after training, they'd work checkpoints for the city at night just as volunteers. But that was, the limitation we had. I think we had about 3 who had ever had in their youth some military training. But it wasn't much, and we were coming at it from the idea that the Marines operate. We have commanders, obviously. I've been a commander, but the idea is that everyone understood how to step into the next position of command. If I get schwacked, there's someone who steps in, and it goes all the way down. Within a fire team, everyone knows that there's the fire team leader, but if they're gone, that person's the fire team leader.
Yeah.
If that person's gone, well, there's just 2 of you, but and it happens within a squad, which is 3 fire teams. And so my thinking, of course, was to build them into a Marine model of a squad leader, 3 squads, each with a team leader, and everyone understood how to be the squad leader. Everyone. And that's the critical weakness right now in Russian leadership. When they become decapitated, the unit is done. No one below understands how to command, understands organizational leadership, can do anything. And that's why they're surrendering or abandoning their positions or just dying in place. So this would be the way to create an agile unit that could replicate itself after we were gone. You know, because we were leaving. I didn't know how much more we could replace ourselves in terms of foreign support. And I wanted to create at least a level of competence that could train other trainees.
Good.
And at the same time, understood how to be that flexible unit. Could also operate as independent cells, which is also important because the whole community is not going to fight. These people needed to be able to, just with cell phones or with Radio Shack radios, be able to communicate as smaller units and be able to function in a leadership way without an overarching command, which I thought would be difficult to coordinate with the current state of the Ukrainian military and the Territorial Defense Force and, of course, the city itself. A lot of this was going to have to be, you know, independent, community-based efforts with some lateral understanding of what the next unit's doing. That was kind of taking the whole thing from zero, make them into a first. We taught them how to be, just on the basic level, a decent, competent, offensive force,
right,
moving down roads, moving through buildings, all that kind of stuff. But mostly it was to show them how to defeat that, because I didn't think they were going to be offensive in the end.
Right.
So I was like, okay, now you understand how the best unit can organize and move through a community and a building. Here's how you fight that.
Right.
And then we showed them all the critical weaknesses of an offensive force, making them into an effective defensive force. And so the whole 2 weeks was built on doing one thing to transition into, the defense itself, which is, it's the defense always has the advantage.
Right.
And, just down to even the simplest things like save all your bottles. Always keep a few containers of gas in the basement with all your leftover cotton shirts, so that in the end, if you had to make 100 Molotov cocktails, you can.
Right.
Make sure everything's stored safely, but also make sure everyone understands and helps. Make sure everyone, it's like World War II when we were saving, aluminum foil and peach pits, which create the most refined kind of charcoal for gas masks. Everyone in America was saving these things. This is kind of like, okay, we're now in war desperation thought. Mm-hmm. How do we use what people actually readily have, rather than yearning for the things I think we'll never get.
Right.
And if you see the early videos, communities were making, Molotov cocktails out of wine bottles and juice bottles, and taking out armored vehicles at the outskirts of cities,
right,
dropping them off bridges and from buildings. And I showed these videos. I'm like, this isn't the movies. These are your people doing this, and it's completely effective. It's dangerous, but it's effective. And you have gasoline, you have bottles, and you have cotton. I don't need to worry about you not having these things.
Right. Let's
move on to the next thing that we can do that you have.
As a hypochondriac myself, I'm always thinking like, and I mean, I've had someone try to come into my house early on when we moved in. I've had someone break into my house. So occasionally I think of like, what if somebody tries to do it while I'm there? I mean, which I wasn't there the first time they tried, but Trina was. And, but I think like, what would I do? So like, I have strategically placed certain things around the house in the event that like I have to defend myself in my own home. And one of the things I do is I keep a pot of water on the stove. If someone or several someones are trying to get into the house, one of the first things I'm going to do is run over and turn the burner up, because if they are successful, when they get into the home, I will have a boiling pot of water that I can throw in their face as a defense.
Wow, I hope I don't ever accidentally wake him up from a deep sleep, Ben. You know, go into his house and get hot boiling water poured over me.
Well, you got to wake him up so he can turn the water on.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, if you're already in my bedroom, I'm screwed.
You might want to move your stove to your bedroom.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's many things, and not to like we were talking earlier about the troubles that everyone has, and how mochas and lines are terrible for Americans to tolerate. You know, we can't do all these different things because of our freedoms, but you know, it's not to belittle anyone's struggles. There's people who, you know, as you know, are going through in their own mind terrible things, and as lawyers, you know, Travis, you certainly know,
yes, sir.
People come heavy with the trauma of just lives ruined by you know, the end of relationships, the end of days of their parents. You know, there's so many, you know, that we don't get into accidents,
right,
and injuries. But I think the point that you were trying to make is, you know, let's not live in a land of false equivalencies.
Right.
No, I was just trying to belittle everyone.
Yeah.
No, but the point you were making is this is not the same. And,
right. Absolutely.
You know, you understand their problems, but it's not like, okay, you have to carry your child for 48 hours without putting them down to get to a bus to get you to the Polish border.
Right.
And that's what we were watching. As we drove out of, you know, Poland was brightly lit, a fully international commercial gem, clean and happy. And we hit the Ukrainian border at night, and it was blacked out because of bombing. So there was no lights in the entire place. It was like there was a line into the wilderness, and the road kept on going, but there was nothing on it except people, you know, in buses coming north. And, you know, as we drove across the border, though, this is early on. We got there, you know, a week after the invasion. There was a line that was miles long of mothers holding their children. And I mean, I look at communities now, I look at people dealing with kids, and I think, I mean, it's a struggle to be a parent. I've got to the point where I have two teens, girls, and it's, you know, it's a lot of work, but I've never had to carry them on my waist with my entire life in one suitcase to parts unknown for 48 hours on a street in the dark. I look at my problems, like you were saying, you know, yeah, it's a struggle to do these things. It's hard to be a parent, but it isn't that hard. Right. It's not hard like that.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, in this moment, you know, I have to kind of put aside my inconveniences and my own kind of personal weight and say, well, it could always be heavier. Yeah. And there's places in America that are.
Sure.
Absolutely.
There's people in abusive relationships where they are at war. They've been at war for years.
Right.
And, you know, it's hard for us to imagine, but this kind of reminds us of how hard it can be to be a human in this world, how cruel it can be. And in the end, you know, who saves us? Law, right? This comes all the way back. You know, justice. And how do we distribute justice fairly to those who really deserve it, here and anywhere? You know, and I look at war crimes right now and I think, okay, at what point, how do we make amends for this? How do we get justice for this? Who's going to pay for this? Not just financially. Who's going to pay for having done these things?
All right, Ben, we get it. I'm a jerk. I should have worded my point more effectively.
I'm not attacking you. I'm not attacking you. I'm
kidding.
I'm going
on
about. I'm trying to expand on what you started to.
No, I know. I'm giving you a hard time.
You're giving yourself a hard time.
There was an article about this in where did you
Esquire,
and then
Anderson Cooper.
Anderson Cooper. We certainly appreciate your time this morning, as always, but more importantly, thank you for, within a few hours' notice, picking up and going and doing something like this. I'm representing the United States in a way that you've never really represented them, because it wasn't, as we said, with the patch of the United States on your shoulder,
Yeah.
Right.
But thank you both for your time there, your time this morning, and it's always good to catch up with you.
A pleasure to go overtime. I always like that when they
Yes.
say the show is over, and I begin laughing.
Well, we'll have you back again soon, and until then, get to work on your squatter's
hut.
Yeah. This has been Law Lite, brought to you by Foreman Watson Holtry, fwhlegal.com. You can find all kinds of information about the firm at fwhlegal.com and all of our other platforms of social media. And be grateful for that social media, for there's many countries around the world where it's forbidden. Until next time, thank you.
This case should never have come to trial.
I don't think it's fair to call my clients frauds. Because one time I turned into a dog and they helped me. Thank you.
Your Honor, we would like to withdraw our plea of not guilty and enter a plea of guilty.
This trial is a travesty. It's a travesty of a mockery of a sham, of a mockery of a travesty of two mockeries of a sham.
If we are to have faith and justice, we need only to believe in ourselves.
And the truth shall set you free!
How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Oh, guilty, but with a real good excuse.
I think the truth will come forth.
You can't handle the truth!